Space is quite vast.
We're receiving a signal.
On audio, Lieutenant.
Oh my God, it's full of stars.
Doc, you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
Prepare ship for military speed.
Into the limitless boundaries of space.
It's in the name of science.
Absolutely marvelous.
The latest result in machine intelligence.
I'll be back. God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs. I am your father. The podcast from Planet
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast from Planet X. My name is Ben, and with me today, as always, is my co-host David.
And a series of slightly obnoxious bowls, or whatever, is clicking in the background.
Yeah, my wife being very, very loud. Thank you. Anyway, so the gist of this podcast is David and I are going to sit down and watch sci-fi movies, big and small, old and new, and we're just going to talk about them, talk about whatever strikes our fancy. And this week, or this episode, I should say, because this is not going to be weekly by any sense of the imagination, we watched Time After Time. It came out in 1979. The general synopsis is H.G. Wells, played by Malcolm McDowell, has built a time machine, and he plans on using it to travel to a utopian paradise in the future. But before he can, Jack the Ripper, played by David Warner, on the run from the police, uses it to escape and travel to 1979. Wells follows and enlists the help of a bank teller named Amy, played by Mary Steenburgen, to catch Jack before he continues his killing spree. As they work together, Wells falls for Amy, even as she has a hard time believing his wild story of time travel. The movie was directed by Nicholas Meyer, who he didn't really do anything else of note that I could really see. He directed a couple of Star Trek movies, the older ones, and he wrote a script. He wrote the script for the pilot that was supposed to be based on this movie that didn't come out. I think it was supposed to come out in like 2017, but that's the basic gist of this movie. So David, what are your general thoughts on this movie?
Okay, so my general thoughts on the movie. You should watch it at least once if you've never seen it before, because it actually is somewhat of an interesting movie. I think the movie in itself is not the greatest movie out there. In fact, I said it was terrible to Ben multiple times. He seems to disagree with me on that, which is fine. I don't really care. But the actual plot devices within the movie and some of the research that goes along with it is actually really interesting, and I really did like it. I just think the movie as a whole is garbage. Specifically production and other things involved with it.
I can agree with you as far as some of the aspects of the movie go. It's not the greatest movie in the world, but like you said, I think you should definitely give it a watch at least once if you haven't seen it. As far as the production direction goes, like even when I was watching the commentary for this movie, the director said that multiple times that this was obviously this was his first movie that he ever directed. So there was a lot of things that he was mentioning that he should have done, which he definitely should have done, like missing close-up shots and everything. And I don't know, the production direction of this movie was not great. I think he should have stuck to just writing the script, because the script itself is not terrible. Some of the acting is a little cringy.
Yes.
There are moments that are really, really well acted, like the scene in the hotel with Wells and Jack,
Yeah.
where he's got him sat down and he's watching the TV. That part of that scene is actually in the intro to the podcast. If you guys are wondering, if that scene doesn't sell you on watching this movie, then nothing will, because that is probably the best scene in the movie. Okay, just to clarify, before we had our amazing intro from the Tormented Teamster, we had a different one that we were using, and that's what we're referencing here. But I'll go ahead and play the clip that we're talking about right here, so that you can kind of understand what we're saying.
You haven't gone forward, Herbert. You've gone back.
We've just received word that Mayor Griffin Margolin of Columbus, Ohio, was shot.
We don't belong here. On the contrary, Herbert. I belong here completely and utterly. I'm home. It's you who do not belong here. You, with your absurd notions of a perfect and harmonious society, is drivel. The world has caught up with me and surpassed me. 90 years ago, I was a freak. Today, I'm an amateur. You go back, Herbert. The future isn't what you thought. It's what I am.
The music was good. And as far as the music goes, there's actually a pretty interesting anecdote that I saw also while watching the commentary. The music was composed by some guy named Miklos Rosa. He won 4 Academy Awards and wrote the music for movies like Ben-Hur and The Thief of Baghdad. Warner Brothers apparently didn't like his music. They wanted to change it, but as soon as the score was done, the director, Nicholas Meyer, took out a full-page ad in Variety magazine so that if Warner Brothers were to change the score, it was an extremely public thing that Rose's music wasn't in the movie anymore.
That's kind of one way of it's a creative way of doing it too, just forcing their hand on that one, like, what are you going to do about it now?
Yeah, like exactly. That. It's like the modern day version of a celebrity going on Twitter and being like, and like putting somebody on blast for doing something.
Basically.
Yeah.
Backhanded. I like it.
But the music, I was listening to it specifically the second time I was watching through, when I was watching it for the director's commentary. Like, they leave parts of it unedited without anybody talking over it. So I did get a chance to listen to it after they mentioned it. And most of it is really, really, really good. It fits the movie really well. I can't really say that there are any other aspects of the production that could have been that I didn't particularly like. Like, the special effects, I guess, are something that I wasn't particularly fond of, but it was also 1979, so it wasn't like, it's not like the movie came out like last year and they had, and you could do the special effects on a laptop or whatever. This is something they were still filming on film, and they had to like cut out everything as far as the film goes if they wanted to replace something, or they had to hand draw these animations, which they have all over the place in this movie. So I respect the amount of work that went into it, but I'm still not fond of the visual effects. I think they're really pretty poor looking in comparison to even some of the movies that came out that year.
Yeah, but it goes with the time, and it goes with the technology that they had, and I mean, there's really not much else they could do with it. There's a few things that I think that they did in poor taste, specifically the little animation of the crystal doing its little sparkly bit when Wells is explaining its importance to the time machine, and things like that. That was a bit of a poor taste choice. Everything else, it's okay. It fits.
The stuff that they did with the actual time machine when it's like going through time, that was all right. But yeah, I agree. The crystal thing was a little bit much. That was a little bit too on the nose. Yes. I think.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, so as far as everything else in the movie goes, we can talk about some of what I think is like the most, probably, I don't know, it's the most poorly done aspect of the film just because it was so obvious. The moments where something was like extremely like telegraphed like way in advance. It's a principle that's called Chekhov's gun. And if you want to explain it, David, I know you know a little bit about it. If you want to explain it briefly.
It's basically just an instance in the movie where they're just going to super hyper explain every single like minute detail for like no apparent reason, and it's just obvious that it's going to end up playing some huge part in the movie later on, and it gives away. There's some instances where I like it and it's okay and it's appropriate, but then there's other instances, not specifically in this movie, but in other movies that implement this a lot. It gives away too many plot holes, and there's no surprise left when they do things like that. In this movie, kind of overextended it to a certain extent because they gave away a lot of things. Like I could have been surprised by that, and that would have been a neat trick. But no, you kind of spoiled it. So
they did. There was 4 specific instances that I could find, and there might have been more, but these were like the biggest. So early on in like probably the first 10 minutes of the movie or something like that, when he was showing off the time machine, there's two instances of a Chekhov's gun moment, if you will, where he's explaining how the time machine works. The first one is with the key, like the return key. So basically, if you stick the key in like this hole in the dashboard of the time machine and turn it, then the time machine will stay where it's at. Otherwise, it will automatically return to its origin point. And then the second thing is a crystal that it doesn't. Does he ever explain what the crystal actually does besides what it does if it's not in the time machine?
Not in. He does, but it's not in a way that makes a lot of common sense and something that can be explained in generic jargon. Because if you don't say it exactly the way he says it in the movie, it will not make sense to anybody who has not seen it. So yes, he does, but not in a way that's repeatable. You'd have to quote it verbatim.
Okay. Well, basically, as far as the movie is concerned, as far as like the plot of the movie, the time machine, the crystal in the time machine, if it's not present when the occupant takes off for a voyage through time, then basically what happens is the person is sent forward through time, but the machine is not. So they're effectively like disintegrated and scattered throughout the millennia or whatever. I don't know.
There's absolutely no way of coming back because
exactly.
The machine didn't go with them or anything. So it's like a huge safety feature, basically.
Yeah. The next one that I found, and the one that I found to be like the most, like the worst offender in the movie, I think, is the fact that it's even mentioned multiple times that Amy's apartment door needs to be slammed or else it won't lock properly. I felt like, I mean, I don't really know any other way to like do the scene without doing that, I mean, I guess Jack could just like break down the door. I don't know why he wouldn't do that in the first place if he really wanted to get in. But if he really wanted a plot point about the door, I don't know any other way to do it other than what they did. I still think it's like super tacky for them to have done it in the way that they did, where it's like, oh, if I don't slam the door, it won't lock. Guess what? Jack the Ripper knows where I live now. Oh no. Guess I better not slam the door the one time I need to.
I don't think that there's any way that could have been handled worse than what it was.
Yeah.
Like you said, he could have broke down the door. He's got this stupid equipment that, of course, now the bag didn't come with him to the future, but I'm sure he's reacquired this equipment that he's been slashing people with.
Exactly.
He can just pick the lock or something, or maybe do like a knife pressed up against the door, or a credit card type trick where you just pick the lock like that by just moving the actual hinge or something.
Yeah,
there's tons of ways to do
locks
it.
are not that complicated.
Exactly, and it's like, why did they do it like this?
Yeah, I don't know. Like you said, I don't think there's another way that they could have done it, but this is definitely the worst way to have handled that. And then the last one that I found was I can't remember exactly where in the movie it was. I think it was like after their like lunch date or whatever. But where she's driving on the bridge and he's like watching her.
Yes.
He's watching her drive, so it makes sense that later on in the movie, towards the end, he knows how to drive her car, and they can do this car chase at the end.
But it wasn't good enough to be astutely watching what she's doing. He's also got to talk himself through it out loud, like, oh, R would stand for reverse, and D would stand for drive, and the pedal on the left decelerates us, and the pedal on the right accelerates us. And it's like, yeah, had to go that far into this to explain that he's, quote, trying to learn how to drive a car. And you just know that he's going to need this information later just by how much they focused on it. It's another Chekhov's gun instance, and it's another pretty bad example of it too, I think.
Yeah.
It was over the top.
Like I said, I don't think it's the worst one in the movie. The lock one is definitely the worst,
yes,
but this
I
is
agree.
a pretty close second.
Yes.
Like I completely forgot that he talked himself through how to do it, like asking her questions and everything, and that makes it way worse. Like, jeez. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's about it as far as the movie's plot is concerned. We should probably kind of talk about the message that the movie is kind of trying to bring across. As far as the director is concerned, he was intending Wells and Jack to be two sides of the same coin. Wells is supposed to be like a constructive force, and then Jack is supposed to be a destructive force, which, I mean, they definitely got Jack down, considering he kills, like four or five people after he comes to the future?
5.
Yeah, five people. So, they got Jack right. I'm not 100% sold on whether they got Wells right for as far as their intention goes.
If you looked at it from outside the movie's perspective, then yes, they did. But if you look at it from the movie's perspective and everything that was accomplished in the actual movie, I would have to agree. I don't think they nailed it quite right. There was too much. There's too much focus on the man being out of his time. All the things that he had to do to. I don't know. It's just every little thing like blew his mind, and it would if you went 90 years in the future and you've never seen a telephone, or you've never seen vehicles driving around, or television, simple things blew his mind. He goes as far as sticking a fork in a garbage disposal just to see how that worked. I mean,
Yeah.
there was too much of that in the movie for him to do anything constructive, in my opinion. He was too focused on learning about the new time period that he's in to actually do anything constructive. He didn't really set forth any standards. He didn't do anything really, except manage to get a woman back to 1879 or whatever it was.
1893. Yeah.
1893. There you go.
Yeah, they definitely use the whole like, I'm in the future, I need to explore everything thing. They use it as a little bit of a crutch, honestly.
Yeah,
because there was, like you said, it makes sense, but it feels like it's the main focus of the movie at times. It doesn't really seem like they're doing anything to develop Wells's character any. Like,
no.
He doesn't really have any discernible arc as far as this movie is concerned, honestly. He kind of stays the same. He's a little bit less snobby at the end, because he at the beginning of the movie, he's kind of like, he's a little bit prudish and whatnot, and I don't know, he's very much a man of his time. But throughout the movie, he does get a little bit mellower.
Yeah.
Mostly because he meets Amy.
Yes.
But beyond that, he doesn't really have any discernible arc.
No.
And I mean, neither does Jack, but he's a villain. He doesn't really need to have an arc. So yeah, I don't know. They didn't, I don't think they really did a decent job of doing what they wanted to do with this movie as far as he's concerned. They did have some really good scenes, at least, maybe not scenes, but at least two opposing scenes in the movie that shows the dichotomy between the two. So if you remember earlier in the movie, like right after Wells gets to the future, he's trying to pawn off some jewelry that he brought in. He goes to a jeweler, and the guy's like, wow, these are really nice pieces. Can't give you top dollar for them, but you want to sell them to me? Wells is like, yeah, I'll sell them to you for whatever you want to give me.
Yep.
And then the guy's like, well, I need to see some ID. What do you mean you need to see some ID? Well, I need to make sure these aren't stolen. So Wells is like, I can guarantee you that these aren't stolen on my word as a gentleman.
Yeah, I give you my word as a gentleman.
Mm-hmm. And it makes sense considering what time he's in. They're all about being gentlemen and high-class society and whatnot. And even though Wells, as far as his personal philosophy goes, was a little bit ahead of his time, considering his ideas about socialism and women's rights and all the other political stuff that he was in, the word as a gentleman thing was still a very, very big thing for Wells. And then in one of the last scenes in the movie, at the... What is that place called? Was it like a Parthenon or something?
I forget exactly what it was supposed to be, but it was no, I don't. I remember now. This actually, I only remember this because of some of the stuff I was watching earlier, as far as documentaries go. It was an exhibition for Pan American exhibition back in 1914 in San Francisco.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They mentioned that. I remember now. Okay, so, anyway. This is at the point in the movie where Wells thinks Jack has murdered Amy because long story short, he gets taken to the police, He gets arrested due to a few different things. And while he's in police custody, Jack gets to Amy's apartment and kills somebody, which everybody presumes is Amy. So Jack is let go because they realize that Wells is let go because they realize that he's not the murderer. And he's walking through this Pan Am exhibit, and he sees Amy at like the end of it, and he realizes that Jack is right there with him, or with her. So Wells goes up to them. Jack is like, you need to give me the key to the time machine, or I'm going to kill her. But if you give me the key, I will let her go. On my word as a gentleman.
Yep.
Wells gives him the key, but Jack does not let Amy go. Because it's kind of... The movie doesn't explain this at all, but watching the commentary, you can kind of see what their thinking was. He doesn't let her go because he believes that he is a man of the future. He believes that he belongs in this time, which is another reason that the hotel scene is like the absolute best scene in the movie, because it kind of explains his thinking as far as where the world is at and why Wells is sort of depressed throughout the like middle of the movie. It's a really, really interesting scene.
I think the best way to put that is to just go by the quote that he tells Wells. You should know by now that I am not a gentleman.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the best way to describe that one.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that this movie got right, was at least as far as those two scenes go, you can really see the difference in mindset.
Yeah.
As far as those two go. Like, even at the end of the movie, Wells is still like, my word as a gentleman means something. Mm-hmm. And so to have that just thrown back in his face was just like a huge slap in the face to him, basically.
Yeah. Which is basically what he's been doing all along, because one of the things that they open up with after they show... after Wells shows the dinner party guests the time machine, is him and Jack playing a game of chess. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing that's brought up a lot in the movie. Jack seems to know everything that Wells is thinking. He beats him at the game of chess. He basically outsmarts him as far as the victims go. All that stuff. So it plays into it a lot.
Yeah, one of the main things that he says during that chess scene is, you'll never beat me unless you can learn to think like me.
Yeah.
So that also kind of plays into the scene at the very end of the movie, where we see the payoff for the time crystal Chekhov's gun moment, where Jack is in the time machine, he's getting ready to set off, but Wells pulls out the crystal. And Jack he looks at him and he knowingly nods. He's like,
mm-hmm.
okay, yeah, you've got me.
You've got me.
There's nothing I can do. You have beaten me
mm-hmm.
because you finally thought like I would. I don't think if we were at that scene at the beginning of the movie, I don't think that Wells would have done what he did at the end of the movie.
No, I don't think so.
So that is one thing that changed. But yeah, I don't know. They've got an interesting dichotomy as far as those two characters go, I think. But like I said, Wells doesn't really have a gigantic character arc in this. It's more of like maybe a little bit of a... If I had to put a degree on it, it's like a 2-degree curve or something like that. It's not gigantic.
All right. So what do you think about... things brought up in the movie, not talking about the movie specifically, but things brought up in the movie from his time, and also throughout the time travel that happened, different issues that they rose up. His ideas of a utopian society, women's rights, and other things that they brought up. What do you think about some of that stuff?
I thought, like you said, the movie doesn't really touch on it a whole lot. It's really interesting. I know he doesn't learn about it in the movie, but I thought it was really interesting that they showed, that we heard like a speech from Hitler when he's traveling through time. So you could kind of see if any of you guys know anything about history, that like this whole Hitler's regime and then the Cold War, which was still going on at this time when Wells goes to the future, all of those things started out as socialism, but they morphed into something that was not socialism, which is why socialism isn't necessarily, as far as I'm concerned, isn't necessarily the way that the world should go. A capitalistic society is also not necessarily the way things should go, because we in the U.S. live in a pure capitalist society, and it's not exactly great for the lowest among us. But that's not to say that socialism would necessarily make it any better. Partial socialism, like we've got going on in Britain and some of the European countries, would, it works over there. I think it would work here. But as for transferring over to a fully socialist political society, I don't see how that would work. I don't.
Yeah, there's things about it that are both good and bad on both ends of it, and that's more of a. It's hard to say. It definitely didn't pan out the way Wells had thought it would pan out. Not as far as what his vision of a utopia was going to be, because if anything, it just proved that Jack was right, and everything has just gone to hell in a handbasket at that point. I mean,
doing some research. There were a bunch of things that was happening during the 70s. In the movie itself, we didn't really touch on it at all so far, but they do mention guns a fair bit, how guns are sold in the shops, and they have a few shots where Wells is just, doing his thing in a shop, and there's guns in the background and people buying guns in the background.
Yep.
And that's one of the big things that Jack touches on in the hotel scene. He's like, guns are sold in corner stores all over the place. They encourage it. Mm-hmm. It's crazy to think that over less than 100 years from where Wells was to, it's an entirely different country too. So obviously the ideals aren't necessarily going to be 100% the same, but his vision of a utopian society definitely didn't come true.
No. Well, and it's also very, very interesting how quickly that reversed, specifically in California, in San Francisco, where this has taken place. Mm-hmm. You're not going to see what happened in that movie happen not even 15, 20 years later. I mean, they cracked down big time on that type of stuff. You ain't buying a gun in no gun shop anywhere in California as far as the that side of things is concerned.
Yeah. Even in some other states, there are gun. You can't buy a gun in a shop anywhere either, unless it's like a gun store.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, doing some research, there are a lot of political happenings that went on during the 70s. If you can go through, I'll let you go through the bad ones that I found, the interesting bad ones that I found.
Alrighty, so a few of the bad things that was happening at the time frame that he arrived. Good old Nixon. Who could forget that whole issue? He goes in and abolishes a lot of Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty. So there's a lot of things that he kind of tightened the purse strings on, and definitely cut funding for things. You've got the 1972 Act of Congress approving the Equal Rights Amendment, but it needed 38 states to ratify the amendment, and they only got 35. The last one being Indiana in 1977. So that was something else that had failed and wasn't really the greatest. The U.S. invades Cambodia in 1970. And as a direct result of that, there was a protest happening at Kent State University in Ohio. And a lot of people might remember this if they paid attention to the history or not. But 4 of those student demonstrators were shot at the anti-war rally, and that became known as the Kent State shooting. 10 days later, there was 2 black students killed at Jackson State University down in Mississippi. So that was closely related to that as well. And then, of course, Watergate.
Probably the biggest political scandal of the 20th century.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can't believe how bad that was, too. I mean, even looking at this, it was like, oh my goodness, is this really what happened?
And then something you missed on the first line. There was actually, not that Nixon needs to be made into any more of a scumbag, but he actively resisted desegregation plans throughout the U.S. after Lyndon B. Johnson's term as president. Gotta love him, right? Good old Nixon.
I'd forgotten about that.
So, as bad as the 70s were, there were a few good things that started happening. There was a major gay rights march in October of 1979. Nixon proposed a family assistance plan that would have guaranteed every American family an income of $1,600 a year, which is about $10,000 today. And he urged Congress to pass a comprehensive health insurance plan that would have guaranteed affordable health care to all Americans. Sounds a little bit like the Affordable Care Act that we have going on now, which, say what you will about it, people have different opinions. I'm not going to voice mine right now. It's interesting to see that Nixon was the one that proposed and tried to pass some of these things, considering literally what we talked about 5 minutes ago. But there it is.
On a dime.
And then the environmental movement was starting to take shape during the 70s. So there was a lot of protests against the environment. Like there was protests against industrial waste in places like Love Canal, New York. There was protests against the meltdowns at nuclear power plants like the one at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Yeah, and protests against putting highways through city neighborhoods, which apparently people thought was a good thing to do, I guess. And then we celebrated the first Earth Day in 1970. And finally, as a direct result of the failure of the Equal Rights Act, which we, again, talked about a few minutes ago, feminists turned away from politics. Instead, they focused on building organizations and communities of their own, like art galleries and bookstores and daycare and crisis centers. And I believe they started Planned Parenthood around then, too. Yeah. I don't think there's really anything else we can say about this, I like we said, if you haven't seen the movie, it's an interesting watch, especially considering everything we've talked about so far. Is it a must watch? I don't know if I would call it that. Would you?
A must-watch, no. If you're actually interested in some of his ideas, Wells in particular, his utopian societies, and all the other things that he wrote books about. I mean, the time travel aspect of it is very fascinating. So if you're interested in these types of things, as you should be if you are listening to a sci-fi podcast, I say yes. It's a good movie to get ideas from. I'm not going to say it's a good movie to watch for a pure entertainment basis, because that it is not. But as an inspiration, yes, it's probably a must watch in that aspect.
This movie definitely made me want to check out. I think I've read The Time Machine before. but it definitely made me to want to reread it, and along with a couple other of his books. I know I've read War of the Worlds. That's actually really good. But The Time Machine, I definitely need to watch again. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting movie for the time. The script is interesting. The director, while not that great, had some pretty interesting ideas for the direction to take the movie. And if it makes you want to read an H.G. Wells book, then I think it did its job.
Yeah, reading is fun. Educational.
Yeah, well, I think that's where we're going to leave this episode, guys. Thank you for checking out our first episode. Before we go, if you had to rate this movie out of 5 sparkling time crystals, what would you give it?
I'd say I'd give it probably a 2.8, maybe a 3.2. Somewhere along those lines.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm going to give it like a solid 3. Maybe go up to a 3.2 like you, but I'm definitely settling at a 3. So, yeah, that's it for this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast from Planet X. We are hosted, edited, and produced by Ben Mason, and co-hosted by David Knowles. Our theme song is produced by the Tormented Teamster. You can follow Ben on Twitter at BenPlaysVidyaS, that's Ben Plays VIDYAS, and you can follow David on Twitter at Car6x16. If you want to keep the conversation going, you can contact the show on Twitter at PlanetXPod or by email at podcastfromplanetx@gmail.com. That's all for this episode. We'll see you next time.